6 members of a wealthy Michigan family were shot and bludgeoned to death in their lakeside vacation cottage on June 25, 1968. Their bodies went undiscovered for 27 days in the summer heat, while neighbors assumed they had simply left on an extended trip. When the cottage caretaker finally entered the property on July 22nd, he found a crime scene so horrific it would become known as Michigan's worst mass murder. The killer had fired shots through a window, entered through an unlocked door, and systematically executed Richard Robison, his wife Shirley, and their 4 children aged 7 to 19. Then he turned on the heat, locked the doors, and left a note saying the family would return in 2 weeks. The prime suspect was Joseph Scolaro III, a 30-year-old Harvard graduate and trusted employee who had been embezzling from Richard Robison's company. Scolaro had no alibi for the day of the murders. His boots matched a bloody footprint at the scene. He failed 3 polygraph tests, but prosecutors said they lacked sufficient evidence for conviction. In March 1973, as investigators prepared to finally indict him, Scolaro committed suicide at age 34, leaving behind a note proclaiming his innocence. More than 56 years later, the case officially remains unsolved, and the truth died with Joseph Scolaro. This is the story of the Goodhart murders and a family's vacation that became their tomb. The summer of 1968 arrived with promise and possibility for the Robison family of Lothrop Village, Michigan. Richard Robison, 42 years old, had built a successful career in advertising and publishing, creating a comfortable upper-middle-class life for his wife, Shirley, 40, and their 4 children. They were the kind of family that neighbors admired, hardworking, close-knit, active in their community, living the American dream in a suburban Detroit neighborhood where manicured lawns and friendly waves defined daily life. Richard had founded his own advertising agency and later expanded into publishing, creating a cultural magazine called Impresario that featured arts and entertainment coverage. He was known as a shrewd businessman, but fair, this kind of boss who remembered his employees' birthdays and took genuine interest in their lives. Associates described him as one of the nicest men and fathers they had ever known, a man who balanced professional ambition with deep devotion to his family. Shirley Robison was the heart of the household, managing the complexities of raising 4 children while supporting her husband's business ventures. She was involved in school activities, church functions, and neighborhood gatherings. The kind of mother who baked cookies for school fundraisers and never missed a single one of her children's events. Friends remembered her warm smile and easy laugh, the way she could make anyone feel welcome in her home. The Robison children each had distinct personalities that made the family dynamic, both lively and loving. Richard Jr., at 19, was preparing for college, already showing signs of inheriting his father's business acumen and work ethic. Gary, 16, was in that transitional stage between boy and man, involved in sports and school activities, popular among his peers. Randall, 12, was the middle child with an infectious enthusiasm for life, always ready with a joke or story to make his siblings laugh. And then there was Susan, just 7 years old, the baby of the family who could wrap her father around her little finger with a single smile. In 1956, Richard had purchased property in Goodhart, Michigan, a secluded resort area along the northeastern shore of Lake Michigan in Emmett County. Goodhart was the kind of place that existed outside of time, a tiny community of summer cottages scattered among towering pines, where the air smelled of fresh water and pine needles, where the only sounds were waves lapping against the shore and birds calling from the forest. The area attracted wealthy families from Detroit and Chicago seeking escape from city heat and stress, a place where children could run free and parents could finally relax. The Robison Cottage, which they called Summerset, sat nestled among the trees about a mile down a rugged private dirt road that wound through dense forest. The isolation was part of the appeal. No traffic noise, no crowds, just nature and family time. The cottage itself was modest, but comfortable, valued at $50,000 in 1968, with large windows offering views of the surrounding woods and glimpses of Lake Michigan through the trees. It was a place of memories, birthday celebrations, family game nights, lazy afternoons reading on the porch, swimming in the cold, clear waters of the lake. Every summer, the Robisons would pack up their station wagon and make the drive north from Lothrop Village to Good Heart, leaving behind the responsibilities and routines of ordinary life for a few weeks of paradise. They would spend their days hiking forest trails, fishing from the rocky shore, playing cards in the evening while the sun set over the water. These were the moments that defined their family. The laughter, the togetherness, the simple joy of being together in a beautiful place. In mid-June 1968, the Robisons began their annual pilgrimage to Good Heart. Richard had some business matters to handle before he could fully disconnect, but he looked forward to joining his family for an extended stay. Shirley and the children arrived first, settling into the cottage, unpacking familiar belongings, and slipping immediately into vacation mode. Richard joined them shortly after, ready to spend quality time with his family, away from the pressures of business. The family was last seen by the cottage caretaker, Chauncey Bliss, on June 24th. Bliss lived nearby and was responsible for maintaining the various properties in the area, checking on cottages, handling minor repairs, keeping an eye on things for the wealthy summer residents. He had known the Robisons for years and always enjoyed chatting with them. On that June day, everything seemed perfectly normal. The family was settling in nicely, the children were excited about the summer ahead, and Richard and Shirley were already looking more relaxed than they had been in the city. What nobody knew was that this would be the last time anyone would see the Robison family alive. Within hours of that final sighting, something terrible would happen in that isolated cottage on that private dirt road where no one could hear screams, where help was miles away, where a family's summer vacation would become their grave. The precise timeline of what happened next has been pieced together by investigators over the years, though exact details remain subject to debate. What is known with certainty is that on June 25th, 1968, the day after Bliss saw them alive, the Robison family was murdered in their cottage in an act of violence so calculated and brutal that it would shock even seasoned homicide investigators. And June 25th, 1968, began like any other summer day in Good Heart. The sun rose over Lake Michigan, painting the water in shades of gold and pink. Birds sang in the pine forests. The air was fresh and clean, carrying the scent of the lake and the forest. For families staying in cottages throughout the area, it was another perfect day in paradise. Time to swim, hike, read, relax, enjoy the blessing of summer in northern Michigan. But inside Summerset Cottage, something terrible was unfolding. Investigators would later determine that the murders most likely occurred in the early evening of June 25th. The attack began with the killer positioning himself outside the cottage, in the woods behind the property. From this vantage point, he had a clear view through a rear window into the living area where Richard Robison Sr. sat in a chair, perhaps reading or relaxing after dinner. The first shots came through that window. 5.22 caliber bullets fired from a semi-automatic rifle, all aimed at Richard. The attack was sudden, unexpected, devastating. Richard had no time to react, no chance to defend his family, no opportunity to do anything but die as bullets tore through his body. The sound of gunfire inside the cottage would have been deafening, terrifying. Shirley and the children would have known immediately that something horrific was happening. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, no way to escape. They were trapped in an isolated cottage miles from help, under attack by someone who had come prepared to kill. After shooting Richard through the window, the killer moved to an unlocked door and entered the cottage. He carried two weapons, the .22 caliber AR-7 Armalite semi-automatic rifle he had already used, and a .25 caliber Beretta automatic pistol. Both weapons were somewhat uncommon, not the kind of firearms you picked up at any gun store. Inside the cottage, the killer systematically hunted down the remaining 5 family members. Shirley was shot once in the head with the .25 caliber pistol. She fell in the living room, killed where she stood. Randall, just 12 years old, was shot once in the head and fell in the hallway. Little Susan, at 7, the youngest and most innocent, was shot in the face with a .25 caliber pistol. Then, in an act of shocking brutality, both Susan and Richard Sr. were struck with a claw hammer, their skulls fractured by the blows that came after they were already dead or dying. Richard Jr. and Gary, the 2 oldest boys, likely heard the gunfire and tried to get to a rifle the family kept in a closet in one of the bedrooms, perhaps hoping to defend themselves, perhaps planning to shoot back at whoever was attacking their family. But they never had a chance. The killer found them near that bedroom. Richard Jr. was shot multiple times in the head with a .25 caliber pistol. Gary was shot once in the back with a .22 caliber rifle and twice more in the head with the pistol. The entire massacre probably took less than 10 minutes. 6 people dead, a family completely erased, and the killer standing in a cottage that now looked like something from a nightmare, with bodies sprawled across the floor and blood splattered on walls and furniture. But what happened next reveals the calculated, cold-blooded nature of whoever committed these murders. The killer didn't panic and flee. He didn't leave immediately. Instead, he took time to stage the scene. He closed all the curtains in the cottage, blocking any view from outside. He found a piece of cardboard and crudely covered the bullet holes in the window from his initial attack, attempting to hide evidence of the shooting. He placed a red and black plaid blanket over Shirley's body. He removed some of Shirley's clothing and positioned her body in a way that might suggest sexual assault, though investigators would later determine no sexual assault had occurred. This was pure staging, an attempt to mislead investigators about motive. Then, in a detail that would prove significant, the killer turned on the cottage heating system. It was summer in Michigan, and the weather was warm. Turning on heat made no sense, unless the goal was to accelerate decomposition of the bodies, to destroy evidence, to buy time before the murders were discovered. The killer took an expensive ring from Shirley's hand, but left other valuables untouched. Cash, jewelry, expensive items that any burglar would have taken. This wasn't about robbery. The missing ring was likely another attempt at misdirection. Before leaving, the killer did something that showed just how calculated this crime was. He took a piece of paper towel and wrote a note, which he affixed to the cottage door where anyone approaching would see it. The note read, "Be back by 7:10. Robison." The message was clear. The family had left on a trip and would return in about 2 weeks. Don't bother checking on them. Don't worry if you don't see them for a while. Everything is fine. Then the killer locked the cottage door from the outside and walked away, leaving 6 bodies to decompose in the summer heat behind locked doors and closed curtains in an isolated cottage where no one had any reason to check on the occupants for weeks. 15 spent shell casings were left at the scene, 11 .22 caliber and 4 .25 caliber. The claw hammer used to bludgeon 2 victims was left behind. A single bloody footprint on the floor would become crucial evidence. But the murder weapons themselves, the rifle and pistol, were gone, taken by the killer. As the killer disappeared into the Michigan forest, the Robison family began their slow, terrible transformation from murder victims to decomposing bodies in a sealed cottage where summer heat and humidity would work their gruesome magic. Days passed, then weeks. Life in good heart continued around the locked cottage with its deceptive note. Other families came and went from their summer cottages. Children played on beaches, people hiked through forests, and no one knew that less than a mile away, 6 bodies lay rotting in the heat. The note on the cottage door did exactly what it was designed to do. It prevented anyone from questioning the Robisons' absence. Good Heart was a place where people came and went according to their own schedules, where privacy was respected, where summer residents might stay for a few weeks or few months without anyone tracking their movements. The note saying the family would return by July 7-10 meant neighbors and the caretaker had no reason to be concerned when the cottage sat quiet and apparently empty through late June and into July. Chauncey Bliss, the caretaker who had seen the family on June 24th, occasionally passed by Summerset Cottage on his rounds. He noticed the curtains were drawn, which was a bit unusual since most people kept them open to enjoy the views. At some point in early July, he observed bullet holes in one of the windows. This concerned him enough that he checked underneath the cottage. But he didn't investigate further because he convinced himself that local children must have been playing with pellet guns and accidentally shot at the cottage. It was an innocent explanation, one that made sense in a community where such things occasionally happened. And the note was still on the door. The family said they'd be back. So Bliss went about his other duties and didn't think much more about it. Inside the locked cottage, nature was taking its inevitable course. In the summer heat, amplified by the heating system the killer had turned on, the 6 bodies decomposed rapidly. Within days, the cottage would have become unbearable for any human to enter. The smell of decomposition, that sickly sweet, unmistakable odor of death, began to permeate the structure. But the cottage was isolated, the doors and windows were sealed, and the smell dissipated somewhat in the open air of the surrounding forest. Back in Lothrop Village, questions about the Robison family's whereabouts began to emerge. Richard had business matters that required attention, but he wasn't responding to phone calls or messages. Associates tried calling the cottage. No answer. They assumed the family was simply enjoying vacation and would get in touch when they returned. But as June became July and the expected return dates passed with no word from the Robisons, concern began to grow among friends and business contacts. Still, no one panicked. Summer vacations sometimes extended. Plans changed. Maybe they had decided to stay longer or had traveled somewhere else. In an era before cell phones and constant contact, it wasn't unusual to lose touch with someone for weeks during summer vacation. July in Good Heart was beautiful that year. Tourists came and went. Locals went about their business. Children swam in the lake. Families gathered for cookouts. And less than a mile away, 6 bodies continued their transformation from recognizable human beings to skeletal remains barely distinguishable from one another. The smell, however, was becoming problematic. The heat and humidity of summer in northern Michigan, combined with nearly a month of decomposition, created an odor that even the sealed cottage couldn't completely contain. On July 22, 1968, almost exactly 4 weeks after the murders, several women gathered at a nearby cottage for an afternoon card game. It was a pleasant day, and they sat outside enjoying the weather and each other's company. Their cottage was about 150 feet from Summerset, close enough that a sufficiently strong odor could drift across on the wind. As the afternoon progressed, the women became increasingly aware of a terrible smell. At first, they tried to ignore it. Perhaps a dead animal in the woods, they thought. Something natural, though unpleasant. But the smell grew stronger, more pungent, more disturbing. It was the kind of smell that triggered something primal in the human brain, a warning that something was very wrong. One of the women finally said what they were all thinking. That smell was coming from the Robison cottage. And it didn't smell like a dead animal. It smelled like something much worse. They contacted Chauncey Bliss and told him about the smell. They were concerned, they said. Could he please check on the Robisons? Something didn't feel right. Bliss drove to Summerset Cottage, probably expecting to find nothing more than a raccoon that had died under the porch or some other natural explanation. The smell hit him immediately. Overpowering, nauseating, unmistakable to anyone who had ever encountered it before. This was the smell of death. Human death. The cottage doors were locked. Bliss called out, knocked loudly, tried to peer through windows. No response. No movement. Just that terrible smell, getting worse the closer he got to the building. Bliss pried open the molding around one of the doors to gain entry. The smell that rushed out when the seal broke was overwhelming, the accumulated stench of a month's worth of decomposition hitting him like a physical wall. He pushed the door open, stepped inside, and immediately saw the bodies. There are no words adequate to describe what that crime scene must have looked like after 27 days in the summer heat with the heating system running. The bodies were no longer recognizable as the people they had been. Decomposition had advanced to the point where investigators would later need dental records to confirm identities. The heat and humidity had accelerated everything, turning the cottage into a chamber of horrors. Bliss backed out of the cottage and immediately called the Emmett County Sheriff's Office. He was shaking, nauseated, traumatized by what he had seen. Within minutes, law enforcement began arriving at the scene. The discovery of the Robison family murders on July 20, 1968, made immediate headlines across Michigan and soon the nation. A family of 6, including 4 children, murdered in their vacation cottage. Bodies undiscovered for nearly a month. A note suggesting they'd gone on a trip. The sheer horror of it captured public attention and sparked fear throughout northern Michigan. If a wealthy family in an isolated cottage wasn't safe, who was? Or the Michigan State Police and Emmett County Sheriff's Office responded to Summerset Cottage with every available resource. This wasn't just a murder. It was a massacre. The worst mass murder in Michigan history at that time. Detective units, forensic specialists, crime scene technicians, and investigators converged on Good Heart, transforming the quiet resort community into the center of a massive criminal investigation. The crime scene itself presented enormous challenges. The bodies had decomposed to the point where cause of death had to be determined primarily through autopsy and forensic analysis rather than obvious physical evidence. The cottage had been sealed for nearly a month, with the heating system creating conditions that destroyed or degraded much potential evidence. But investigators worked methodically, documenting everything, collecting every piece of potential evidence, photographing the scene from every angle. The bullet casings, the claw hammer, the bloody footprint, the note on the door, the covered bullet holes in the window. Each element was carefully preserved and cataloged. Autopsies on all 6 victims revealed the horrific details. Richard Sr. had been shot in the chest with the .22 caliber rifle and once in the head with the .25 caliber pistol. He had also received a skull fracture from the hammer. Shirley had been shot once in the head with a .25 caliber pistol. Richard Jr. had been shot multiple times in the head with the pistol. Gary had been shot once in the back with the rifle and twice in the head with the pistol. Randall had been shot once in the head. Susan had been shot in the face with the pistol and also struck with the hammer hard enough to fracture her skull. Ballistics analysis determined the .22 caliber bullets came from an AR-7 Armalite semi-automatic rifle, a somewhat uncommon weapon. The .25 caliber bullets came from a Beretta automatic pistol. Neither weapon was found at the scene or recovered during the investigation. The bloody footprint became a crucial piece of evidence. It was distinct enough to determine shoe size and tread pattern, and it suggested one person had committed the murders, not a group or gang, as initially theorized. Investigators rapidly determined several things about the crime. It was premeditated. The killer had come prepared with multiple weapons and had thought through how to stage the scene afterward. It was personal. Robbery was clearly not the motive, since money and valuables had been left behind, except for one ring. The killer knew the family, or at least knew Richard Robison, given the targeted nature of the attack and the knowledge of where the cottage was located. That last point was significant. Summerset Cottage was not easy to find. It sat a mile down a private dirt road through dense forest. You couldn't stumble upon it by accident. Someone had to know it was there, had to have been there before, had to know the family would be there. All individuals the Robisons had encountered during their 9 days in Good Heart were identified and eliminated from inquiry. Local theories about organized crime connections were investigated and discounted. Police began looking more closely at Richard Robison's business and personal life, searching for anyone who might have motive to want him and his entire family dead. That's when they discovered the embezzlement. Richard Robison's advertising and publishing businesses had been experiencing financial irregularities for months leading up to the murders. Substantial sums of money had gone missing from company accounts. Richard had been conducting his own private investigation into the matter, keeping records, tracking the missing funds, building a case, and all signs pointed to one person, Joseph Raymond Scolaro III. Joseph Scolaro III seemed an unlikely murder suspect on the surface. He was 30 years old, a Harvard University graduate, a veteran of the United States Army Security Agency. He was intelligent, well-educated, articulate. He had worked for Richard Robison's advertising and publishing companies since December 1965, holding a senior position in the publishing firm. Richard had trusted him, even leaving him in temporary charge of both businesses when the family went to Good Heart for vacation. But beneath that successful exterior, Joseph Scolaro was living a life built on theft and lies. Investigators discovered that Scolaro had been systematically embezzling money from Richard Robison's companies for months, possibly years. The amounts were substantial, enough that Richard had noticed the discrepancies and begun his own investigation shortly before leaving for vacation. Richard had been keeping detailed records, tracking where money should be versus where it actually was, building evidence of the theft. More importantly, Richard had confronted Scolaro about the missing money. Phone records showed multiple calls between Richard and Scolaro on June 25th, the day of the murders. Scolaro later claimed these calls were routine business matters. Richard asking if certain checks had arrived at the office, standard vacation questions from a boss staying in touch. But Richard's receptionist, Glenda Sutherland, told investigators something different. She said Scolaro had left the office abruptly after receiving the first call from Richard that day, and he wasn't seen or heard from again by anyone, family, friends, colleagues, until 11 p.m. that night when he returned to his home in Birmingham. That was a crucial time period. The murders occurred in the early evening of June 25th. Scolaro had no verifiable alibi for those hours. He claimed he had been driving around, thinking, dealing with stress. But no one could confirm seeing him anywhere during the exact time the Robison family was being slaughtered. Investigators dug deeper into Scolaro's background and found more troubling connections. He had visited Summerset Cottage on at least one occasion prior to the murders. He knew exactly where it was located, knew the layout, knew how isolated it was. He was known to own both a .22 caliber rifle and a .25 caliber pistol, the same types of weapons used in the murders, though he claimed to have sold them both before June 1968. The bloody footprint found at the crime scene was compared to Scolaro's shoes. Investigators discovered he owned a pair of boots that matched the footprint exactly. Size, tread pattern, every detail aligned perfectly. But when they examined those boots, they appeared to have never been worn. The soles were pristine, unmarked, as if they had just come out of the box. Scolaro said he had bought them but never gotten around to wearing them. As the investigation intensified, Scolaro agreed to take polygraph tests. Over the course of the investigation, he would take 3 separate polygraph examinations. He failed all 3. The polygraph examiners concluded he was being deceptive when he denied involvement in the murders. After one examination, the polygraph examiner Ed Goss reportedly told Scolaro directly that he should confess. The evidence was mounting. The lies were obvious. It would be better to come clean now rather than continue denying what seemed increasingly undeniable. But Scolaro maintained his innocence. He insisted he had nothing to do with the murders. He claimed the embezzlement accusations were false. He said someone else must have killed the Robisons. By the second week of the investigation, Michigan State Police and Emmett County authorities strongly suspected Scolaro was their man. The circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. Motive: Richard Robison had discovered Scolaro's embezzlement and was gathering evidence against him. Opportunity: Scolaro had no alibi for the exact time of the murders. Knowledge: he knew where the cottage was and had been there before. Physical evidence: his boots matched the bloody footprint at the scene. Weapons: he had owned the types of firearms used in the murders. Behavior: he failed multiple polygraph tests. Investigators built their case methodically, compiling thousands of pages of evidence, witness statements, forensic reports, and financial records documenting the embezzlement. They traced Scolaro's movements, interviewed everyone who knew him, examined every aspect of his relationship with Richard Robison. In December 1969, 18 months after the murders, investigators presented their case to Emmett County prosecutor Donald Noggle. They believed they had sufficient evidence to charge Joseph Scolaro with 6 counts of first-degree murder. But Noggle disagreed. The evidence was circumstantial, he argued. The boots that matched the footprint had never been worn. How could they have left a bloody print at the scene? The weapons Scolaro supposedly owned had never been recovered. No one had seen him at or near Goodhart on June 25th. The polygraph results, while suspicious, weren't admissible in court. Without direct physical evidence linking Scolaro to the crime scene, without the murder weapons, without witnesses, Noggle believed a jury might not convict. He declined to issue an arrest warrant. The decision devastated investigators who had worked tirelessly on the case. They knew, that Joseph Scolaro had murdered the Robison family. But believing wasn't enough. In the American justice system, prosecutors need evidence sufficient to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt, and Noggle didn't think the evidence met that standard. Scolaro continued his life, taking over Richard Robison's business interests, living freely while 6 people he had allegedly murdered lay in graves, and a community lived in fear that a killer walked among them. But the case wasn't closed. Investigators continued gathering evidence, following leads, building their case, and 3 years later, they would have enough to finally move forward. In 1973, the Robison murder investigation was quietly reopened. New investigators had reviewed the case files and believed they had found additional evidence that, combined with what was already known, would be sufficient to secure an indictment. They prepared to present the enhanced case to prosecutors, confident that this time charges would be filed against Joseph Scolaro. Scolaro apparently learned through unofficial channels that he was about to be indicted. On March 21, 1973, at age 34, Joseph Raymond Scolaro III committed suicide. He left behind a suicide note proclaiming his innocence in the Robison murders. The note's contents have never been publicly released in full. But according to those who saw it, Scolaro maintained he had nothing to do with killing the Robison family. He said the accusations had ruined his life, destroyed his reputation, made it impossible to live normally. He protested his innocence to the very end. Then he took his own life, ensuring he would never face trial, never have to answer questions under oath, never be convicted or exonerated by a jury of his peers. Scolaro's suicide solved nothing, while simultaneously making the case impossible to definitively close. If he was guilty, his death meant he would never be held accountable for the murders of 6 innocent people. If he was innocent, as he claimed, his death meant the real killer would never be found, and he would be remembered forever as the prime suspect in Michigan's worst mass murder. Investigators who worked the case almost universally believe Scolaro was guilty. The circumstantial evidence, they argue, is overwhelming. The motive was clear. Richard had discovered the embezzlement and was about to expose Scolaro, ending his career and likely sending him to prison. The opportunity was there. Scolaro had no alibi for the time of the murders. The knowledge was proven. He knew where the cottage was. The footprint matched his boots. He failed polygraphs, and when faced with finally being charged, he killed himself rather than face trial. But others point out that circumstantial evidence, no matter how compelling, isn't proof. The boots that matched the footprint had never been worn. How could they have left a print? The murder weapons were never found. No one saw Scolaro at Good Heart that day. It's possible, however unlikely, that he was innocent and that his suicide was the act of a man whose life had been destroyed by false accusations. The debate continues more than 50 years later. Marty Link, author of When Evil Came to Good Heart, one of the definitive books about the murders, concludes that Scolaro was almost certainly guilty based on the totality of evidence. Many investigators and prosecutors who have reviewed the case files agree. But without a trial, without a conviction, without Scolaro alive to answer questions or provide his side of the story, absolute certainty remains elusive. What is certain is that after Scolaro's death, the trail went completely cold. If he was guilty, the case died with him. If he was innocent, the real killer had gotten away with murder and would likely never be identified, since all investigative resources had been focused on Scolaro. The Robison family murder case was never officially closed, but it also was never solved. It exists in a strange limbo. A prime suspect dead by his own hand, proclamations of innocence alongside damning circumstantial evidence. A community that believes it knows who killed the Robisons, but can never prove it beyond the shadow of doubt that the justice system demands. Oh, the Robison family murders fundamentally changed Goodhart. What had been a peaceful resort community where families felt safe became the site of Michigan's most infamous, unsolved mass murder. The cottage where 6 people died became a landmark of horror, a place people pointed to and whispered about. A reminder that evil could reach even into the most beautiful, isolated places. For years after the murders, attendance at Goodhart's summer cottages declined. Families who had spent decades vacationing there suddenly felt unsafe. Parents who had let their children roam freely through the forests now kept them close. Doors that had never been locked were suddenly bolted at night. The innocence was gone, replaced by fear and suspicion. Locally, the question of what happened to the Robisons became an obsession. Everyone had theories. Some believed Scolaro was guilty and that his suicide was admission of guilt. Others thought he had been wrongly accused and that the real killer was still out there. Still others believed there must have been more than one killer. How could one person murder 6 people, including 2 teenage boys who presumably would have fought back? The cottage itself stood as a gruesome monument for years. Eventually, it was sold and later torn down. But for a long time, it sat there. A place no one wanted to own. A property forever tainted by what had happened within its walls. Even after it was demolished, the site retained its dark reputation. People still knew where it had been. They still told the story to newcomers and tourists. For the families connected to the Robisons, the pain never faded. Richard and Shirley's extended family lost 6 people in one horrific act. Grandparents lost grandchildren. Siblings lost brothers and sisters. Friends lost people they loved. The grief was compounded by the lack of resolution. No trial, no conviction, no definitive answers. Just a prime suspect who committed suicide while claiming innocence. The funerals for the Robison family were held in Lothrop Village, where they had lived their ordinary, happy lives before that terrible summer of 1968. 6 caskets, 6 lives cut short, a community in mourning, trying to understand how something so horrible could happen to such a good family. Neighbors remembered Richard as a devoted father and successful businessman. They remembered Shirley's warm hospitality and kind heart. They remembered Richard Jr.'s promise and potential. They remembered Gary's energy and enthusiasm. They remembered Randall's humor and joy. They remembered Susan's innocence and sweetness. And they tried to reconcile those memories with the horror of how those lives had ended. Shot, beaten, left to decompose in a locked cottage for nearly a month while a killer walked free. Investigators who worked the case never forgot it. It was the kind of case that haunted you. The kind that made you wake up at 3 a.m. wondering if there was some stone left unturned, some lead not fully pursued, some piece of evidence that could have made the difference. They believed they knew who killed the Robisons. They believed Joseph Scolaro had committed the murders. But belief wasn't enough for prosecution, and Scolaro's suicide ensured they would never get the trial they needed to prove it. Over the years, the case has been examined and re-examined by investigators, journalists, authors, and true crime enthusiasts. Every few years, someone announces they've found new evidence or developed a new theory. The case files have been reviewed multiple times, with each new generation of investigators hoping to find something their predecessors missed. But the conclusion is always the same. Joseph Scolaro was the prime suspect. The circumstantial evidence pointed to him. His suicide, when faced with indictment, suggested consciousness of guilt. But without a trial, without a conviction, the case remains officially unsolved. Modern forensic technology offers some hope. DNA analysis techniques that didn't exist in 1968 could potentially identify the person who left the bloody footprint or who touched certain items at the crime scene. But decades have passed, evidence has degraded, and the chances of extracting usable DNA decrease with each passing year. Some investigators believe the case is essentially solved, just not officially. They point to Scolaro and say, "That's your killer. Case closed," even if the courts never had the opportunity to confirm it. Others maintain that without a trial and conviction, calling it solved dishonors the memory of the victims and ignores the possibility, however remote, that the wrong man was suspected. The debate continues, as does the pain for those who remember the Robisons not as victims in a famous murder case, but as real people with hopes and dreams and futures that were stolen from them. More than 56 years after the murders, fundamental questions about the Goodhart killings remain unanswered. These questions haunt not just investigators and the families of victims, but anyone who has studied the case and found themselves drawn into its dark mystery. If Joseph Scolaro committed the murders, as most investigators believe, did he act alone? The sheer scope of killing 6 people, including 2 teenage boys, who presumably would have tried to fight back, seems almost impossible for one person. Yet the single bloody footprint suggests a lone killer. Could Scolaro have murdered an entire family by himself? Or did he have help that was never discovered? The murder weapons have never been found despite extensive searches. What happened to the AR-7 rifle and the Beretta pistol used in the killings? If Scolaro was the killer, what did he do with them? Did he throw them into Lake Michigan where they would never be recovered? Bury them somewhere in the vast Michigan forests? If someone else committed the murders, where are those weapons now? The boots that matched the bloody footprint at the scene appeared to have never been worn, yet somehow left a print inside the cottage. This detail has never been satisfactorily explained. Were the boots worn for the first time during the murders, then immediately hidden? Did Scolaro buy them specifically for the crime, wear them once, then try to claim they'd never been used? Or does the pristine condition of the boots prove he wasn't at the scene and the footprint match is a coincidence? Why turn on the heating system? This detail has always struck investigators as significant. It was summer. The cottage was already warm. Turning on heat served no purpose except to accelerate decomposition, to destroy evidence, to make the bodies unrecognizable more quickly. This suggests planning, calculation, someone who understood forensics well enough to know that heat and time would work together to complicate the investigation. But would Scolaro, a Harvard graduate and Army veteran, really have thought this would be enough to prevent his identification as the killer? The note on the door saying the family would return by July 7/10 raises questions. Was it written before or after the murders? If before, it suggests the killer somehow forced the family to write it under duress. If after, it means the killer took time after committing 6 murders to calmly write a note designed to explain the family's absence. Either scenario speaks to a chilling level of calculation. Why kill the children? If the motive was silencing Richard Robison because he had discovered the embezzlement, why murder Shirley and 4 children who had nothing to do with the business? Were they killed because they could identify the killer? Did the killer always intend to wipe out the entire family? Or did something go wrong, forcing him to kill everyone to eliminate witnesses? The ring taken from Shirley's hand. Was this a genuine attempt at misdirection, making it look like robbery? Or did the killer take it as a trophy? And if Scolaro was the killer, what did he do with the ring? It was never recovered, never sold or pawned, never seen again. If Scolaro was innocent, as he maintained until his death, who actually killed the Robisons? The investigation examined hundreds of people, followed countless leads, and kept returning to Scolaro as the only person with motive, opportunity, and means. If not him, then who? And how did that person manage to leave so little evidence while committing such a brutal crime? Scolaro's suicide note claimed innocence, but he died without explaining the mountain of circumstantial evidence against him. He died without accounting for his whereabouts during the murders. He died without explaining the embezzlement, the failed polygraphs, the boots matching the footprint. If he was truly innocent, wouldn't staying alive and fighting the charges be the rational choice? His suicide could be seen as admission of guilt, or as the desperate act of an innocent man whose life had been destroyed by false accusations. These questions will likely never have definitive answers. The case is too old. The prime suspect is dead. The evidence has been analyzed and reanalyzed countless times without yielding new breakthroughs. Modern forensic technology offers some possibilities, but whether any usable evidence still exists that could be subjected to DNA analysis remains uncertain. The Robison family murders exist in that frustrating space where we think we know what happened, where most evidence points in one direction, but absolute proof remains elusive. It's the kind of case that makes you understand why the justice system demands proof beyond reasonable doubt. Because even when someone seems obviously guilty based on circumstantial evidence, there's always that possibility, however small, that we're wrong. And if we're wrong, if Joseph Scolaro was innocent as he claimed, then the real killer got away with one of the worst mass murders in Michigan history. They lived their life freely while 6 innocent people lay in graves, and an innocent man was hounded into suicide by accusations he couldn't refute. But if we're right, if Scolaro was guilty as most investigators believe, then he escaped justice through suicide, never having to face a trial, never being held accountable, never giving the victims' families the closure of a conviction and verdict. Either way, justice was never fully served. And that may be the most troubling aspect of the Goodhart murders, not just the horror of what happened, but the lack of resolution that has haunted everyone connected to the case for more than half a century. It would be easy, given all the focus on Joseph Scolaro and the investigation, to lose sight of what this case is really about. 6 people whose lives were stolen from them. Richard Robison Sr. was 42 years old when he died. A man in the prime of life who had built a successful business, provided well for his family, and looked forward to many more years of watching his children grow and achieve their own successes. He was known as one of the nicest men his associates had ever met. A devoted father who balanced professional ambition with deep commitment to family time. Shirley Robison was 40. A devoted mother who made her children and husband her priority, while maintaining friendships and community connections. She was the kind of woman who brought warmth and joy to every gathering, whose home always welcomed neighbors and friends, who would have celebrated many more milestones with her children if she had been given the chance. Richard Jr., at 19, was on the cusp of adulthood, preparing for college and career, full of potential. He never got to experience college, never found his career, never fell in love, never had children of his own, never lived the adult life that should have been his. Gary, at 16, was in that wonderful, terrible stage of mid-adolescence, growing into himself, figuring out who he was, discovering his passions and interests. All of that possibility was erased in a few moments of violence. Randall, 12 years old, still had his whole childhood ahead of him. The teenage years, high school, first love, all the experiences that make up a life, gone before they ever happened. Susan, just 7, was robbed of nearly everything. She never made it to 3rd grade, never grew up, never experienced adolescence, young adulthood, middle age, never had the chance to become whoever she might have been. The Robison family murders took not just 6 lives, but 6 futures. They took all the moments that should have been: graduations and weddings, grandchildren and holidays, ordinary days and extraordinary achievements. They took laughter and love, and the simple joy of being together. This is what murder really steals. Not just the present moment, but every moment that should have come after. Every birthday uncelebrated. Every Christmas without presents under the tree. Every ordinary Tuesday that will never happen. Every sunset that will never be watched. Every I love you that will never be said. For the extended family of the Robisons, the loss reverberates through generations. Grandparents who never saw grandchildren grow up. Cousins who grew up without their playmates. Family gatherings forever marked by absence. The cottage where they died is gone now, torn down and replaced by other structures or reclaimed by forest. But the memory remains. Good Heart will forever be associated with this terrible crime. And the Robison name will forever be linked to one of Michigan's most notorious unsolved murders. But they were more than victims in a famous case. They were real people who laughed and loved, who had favorite foods and songs, who told jokes and shared stories, who made ordinary life extraordinary simply by being together. That's what should be remembered. Not just how they died, but how they lived. Not just the horror of the crime scene, but the love of a family who chose to spend their precious vacation time together in a beautiful place, making memories that should have lasted a lifetime, but instead became the final chapter of their 2 short stories. The Good Heart murders remain officially unsolved. Joseph Scolaro remains the prime suspect, though he was never charged and maintained his innocence until his death. The case files remain open, gathering dust in archives, waiting for some breakthrough that may never come. But the Robisons deserve to be remembered as more than an unsolved case, more than a true crime story, more than statistics in Michigan's murder records. They deserve to be remembered as Richard and Shirley and Richard Jr., and Gary and Randall and Susan, as people who mattered, whose lives had value beyond their terrible deaths. More than 5 decades have passed since that terrible June evening in 1968. The world has changed dramatically. Good Heart has evolved from an isolated resort community to a more developed area, though it still retains much of its natural beauty. Technology has advanced beyond what anyone could have imagined in 1968. Forensic science has made incredible strides, solving cases that seemed impossible to crack. But the Robison family murders remain unsolved. The case files are open. The investigation, technically, never ended. But realistically, without new evidence or witnesses coming forward, the case will never be officially resolved. Marty Link's book, When Evil Came to Good Heart, stands as the definitive account of the murders and investigation. It's required reading for anyone seeking to understand the case in detail. Link concludes, based on extensive research and interviews with investigators, that Joseph Scolaro almost certainly committed the murders. Most people familiar with the case agree, but almost certainly isn't the same as proven beyond reasonable doubt. And without that proof, without that trial and conviction, the case remains in limbo, believed solved by many, officially unsolved by law enforcement records. The cottage site draws occasional curiosity seekers and true crime enthusiasts who want to see where such horror unfolded. But there's nothing to see anymore. The cottage is gone. Nature has reclaimed the site. Only those who know the history can point to the spot and say, "There, that's where it happened." For the families of the victims, closure has never fully come. They live with certainty about who killed their loved ones, or at least strong belief, but without the validation of a conviction. They've had to make peace with never having their day in court, never hearing a guilty verdict, never seeing justice served in the traditional sense. For investigators who work the case, especially those who are still alive, it remains their greatest frustration. They believe they knew who did it. They believe they could have proven it if given the chance. But that chance never came. And now it never will. The Goodhart murders serve as a reminder of several uncomfortable truths about crime and justice. Evidence that seems overwhelming circumstantially may not be sufficient for prosecution. Timing matters. If prosecutors had acted more aggressively in 1969, Scolaro might have faced trial before his suicide. Death by suicide can be the ultimate escape from accountability. And sometimes, despite everyone's best efforts, justice is simply not served. The case also reminds us that evil can reach into the most beautiful, seemingly safe places. Goodhart was paradise, a place families went to escape danger and stress. But danger found the Robisons there anyway. No place is truly safe when someone decides to kill. Most importantly, the Goodhart murders remind us to remember the victims as people, not just as a famous case. Richard, Shirley, Richard Joger, Gary, Randall, and Susan Robison were real people who died horrible deaths and deserved to be remembered for the lives they lived, not just for how those lives ended. Their graves in Lathrop Village still receive visitors, family members, friends, and occasionally people who never knew them, but feel compelled to pay respects to 6 people whose lives were stolen in such a brutal way. Flowers are left, prayers are said, and the question is asked once again, who did this? Why did this happen? And will we ever really know for certain? The official answer remains. The case is open, but unsolved. The perpetrator is believed to be Joseph Raymond Scolaro III, who committed suicide in 1973. But without a trial, without a conviction, without absolute proof, the case exists in perpetual limbo, and 6 people rest in graves. Their lives cut short, their futures stolen, their story forever incomplete.